A broken little girl, a lonely millionaire. One night their paths crossed, and the truth she revealed changed everything he thought he knew about life. Before we dive into today's emotional story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching me from, and what time is it there right now? The storm raged like an untamed beast across the silent city, rain lashing against tall glass towers while streetlights flickered under the furious wind, and through those deserted roads sped a sleek black car, its tires slicing the wet asphalt with elegance. Its driver, a 30-year-old millionaire CEO named Ethan Cross, a man whose name alone commanded respect in boardrooms and headlines, a man who wore power as easily as his tailored blue suit, the crisp tie at his neck a symbol of perfection, success, and control. Yet tonight, even wealth could not shield him from the chill gnawing at his bones, nor the strange restlessness pressing against his heart as if destiny itself were tugging him off his usual path. His hands gripped the wheel, his piercing blue eyes fixed ahead, but deep inside was an emptiness he never confessed to anyone, an ache buried under layers of luxury, until fate revealed itself in the glare of his headlights, cutting through sheets of rain to reveal something so small, so fragile, that for a moment, Ethan doubted his own vision. There, on the side of the road, sat a little girl, no older than 6, her hair the color of pale gold, drenched and tangled by the storm, her tiny body curled protectively around an even smaller bundle, a baby girl who trembled violently against her sister's chest, wrapped in nothing more than a threadbare blanket, the pair of them huddled against a crumbling stone wall as if trying to disappear into the night. Ethan's chest tightened instantly, his foot slamming the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in protest, his breath catching in disbelief. This was not an image that belonged to his world of glittering skyscrapers and champagne-fueled parties. This was raw human suffering laid bare before him, and as he stepped out, the storm seemed to scream louder, as though the heavens themselves demanded he witness it. Rainplast aired his black hair to his forehead, soaking through the expensive fabric of his suit, but he did not care. He could only stare at the heartbreaking sight, the girl's thin yellow jacket clinging to her shaking frame, her bare legs muddy and bruised, her lips trembling from cold. Yet even in her misery she shielded the baby in her arms with a fierceness far beyond her years, a protector forged not by choice but by cruelty. Ethan's voice, usually sharp with authority, softened into a whisper. "What on earth?" The words escaping not as a statement, but as a plea, as if asking the storm itself how such injustice could exist. The little girl lifted her head then, her blue eyes wide and shining with terror, the kind of terror that no child should ever know. And as Ethan stepped closer, cautiously, gently, as one would approach a wounded bird, she let out a sob that pierced him deeper than any business betrayal ever had, clutching her sister tighter, shrinking away as though even the shadow of a man in a suit was a danger too great to risk. Her voice cracked like glass under pressure, carrying words so haunting they froze Ethan in place. "Please don't hurt us. Leave us alone." And in that instant, drenched under the furious night sky, Ethan Cross, billionaire CEO, the man untouchable in every aspect of life, felt his heart shatter into pieces, for nothing in all his empire of wealth had prepared him for a child who believed every stranger was a threat, a child begging for safety in a world that had already failed her. And as thunder rolled above them, he realized this encounter was not coincidence. It was the storm tearing open his carefully constructed life to expose the humanity he had almost forgotten he possessed. Ethan stood motionless, the storm hammering against his back, his breath misting in the freezing air, every instinct inside him warring between disbelief and urge. As he slowly bent down, lowering his tall frame so his eyes met the frightened gaze of the girl shielding her trembling sister, his voice gentle, stripped of the authority it usually carried. In boardrooms, a fragile whisper barely rising above the wind as he said, "I'm not here to hurt you, little one, I promise. But please, tell me, where are your parents?" The question trembled in his throat like a prayer he wasn't prepared to hear answered, and for a moment there was only silence, broken by the rain tapping like sharp needles against the pavement, until the child's thin arms clutched her sister with desperate strength, her tiny body shaking not just from cold but from terror etched far too deep for her age, her lips quivering as tears mixed with raindrops on her pale cheeks. And then, in a voice that cracked like breaking glass, she spoke words that sank into Ethan's chest like knives. "Our stepdad, threw us out. Mommy is in the hospital, he said. He won't pay for us anymore. Each fragment hitting him harder than the last, each pause filled with the weight of a child forced to carry truths no heart that young should ever bear. And Ethan froze, truly froze, as if lightning itself had struck his veins, his mind roaring with fury and disbelief, struggling to comprehend the cruelty behind such abandonment. And in that second, the ruthless tycoon known for never flinching in the face of multi-million-dollar risks felt powerless before the fragile honesty of a child's pain. Because here, under this storm, the numbers in his bank account, the luxury stitched into his suit, the empire he built, all of it was meaningless compared to the injustice before his eyes. He swallowed hard, a storm of his own building inside his chest, questions clawing at his throat. How could any man discard 2 children as if they were burdens? How could any husband look at a woman fighting for her life in a hospital bed and simply refuse her humanity? How could this world be so merciless? And why did fate choose this night, this storm, this corner of the road, to force him to confront it? Ethan wanted to speak, to reassure, to promise safety, but his mouth felt dry, his jaw clenched with rage he dared not show for fear of frightening the little ones further, so he simply let his eyes soften, let his presence bend low, and in the silence between them the storm screamed louder, as though the heavens themselves demanded an answer. Would Ethan Cross walk away as others had, or would he become the hand that fate denied them until now? Ethan inhaled sharply, his chest burning as though the icy wind outside had lodged itself inside his lungs, and without a word he slipped out of his tailored jacket, the one that just hours ago symbolized prestige and status at a conference table, and lowered it gently over the frail body of the baby, the fabric drowning her tiny frame like a blanket of safety, his movements careful, deliberate, almost reverent, and as the warmth of the cloth brushed the child's trembling skin, a small gasp escaped her sister's lips. A sound not of fear but of astonishment, as though kindness itself was something foreign, something she never dared expect from a stranger. Ethan crouched lower, his voice stripped of its commanding edge, softened into something almost fragile. "What's your name?" he asked, each syllable measured, tender, as though the answer would become something sacred, and the little girl blinked through tears, her voice a whisper trembling between trust and doubt. "Lily. And this is my baby sister, Emma." Names so pure, so fragile, they carved themselves into Ethan's soul, and he repeated them silently, as though committing them to memory was an oath he could not afford to break. His throat tightened painfully, an ache clawing upward, because those names dragged forth shadows of his own past, nights of silence where loneliness clung to him like a second skin, moments when he longed for arms to hold him, for voices to whisper safety into his ear, but none came. And now, staring at Lily's small figure clutching Emma with such desperate protectiveness, he felt that same boy inside himself reaching out, not to be saved, but to save, because for the first time in years the armor of wealth and arrogance that wrapped him cracked wide open, and he felt raw, exposed, painfully human, and as lightning tore across the sky above, illuminating their little corner of suffering, Ethan realized this was not a chance encounter, but a test of the very soul he had hidden away. Swallowing against the weight pressing into his chest, he leaned closer, lowering his voice so it was barely more than a breath. "Lily, Emma, you don't have to stay out here in the cold. I can take you somewhere safe." The offer rolling from his lips with the weight of a promise he wasn't sure he deserved to give. And yet the storm in Lily's eyes deepened, suspicion and fear battling with longing, her small shoulders stiffening as she clutched her sister tighter, and in that trembling silence hung the question heavier than the thunder above. Would she trust this stranger who carried both wealth and sorrow in his gaze? Or would she choose the only world she knew, fear, hunger, and cold? For a long moment the storm seemed to pause, as if even the night itself was waiting for the little girl's answer, her fragile body stiff with fear, her small lips trembling as she forced out words no child should ever have to know. "Strangers hurt children. I don't want to go." And the sound of it was like glass shattering in Ethan's chest, a reminder that somewhere in her short years of life, innocence had been stolen, leaving scars invisible but heavy enough to silence her hope. And he felt his own breath catch, his body leaning forward slowly, not to tower above her, but to lower himself to her fragile world, placing a steady hand over his heart, a gesture so uncharacteristic for a man who was used to commanding respect with sharp words and steel composure, and his voice came out softer than he ever thought possible, tender and fragile against the roar of the rain. "Then trust me, not as a stranger, trust me as a friend. I won't leave you here," each syllable carrying a promise he had never made to anyone before, and Lily's wide eyes searched his face with the desperation of a soul trying to read the truth behind unfamiliar kindness, her breath coming in shaky bursts, her tiny hands clinging to Emma as though the baby was her anchor to reality. And then, after what felt like hours compressed into seconds, she gave the smallest nod, hesitant but real, a movement that cracked open the wall between them, and Ethan's chest burned with relief, his arms instinctively reaching forward to lift Emma into his embrace, the baby so light it made his heart ache, her shivers pressing against him like icy daggers. And without a word he guided Lily toward his car, shielding her from the storm as if his very body could block out the cruelty of the world, opening the door with care, settling Emma against the warmth of his chest as Lily climbed in cautiously, her eyes darting to every corner as though expecting the safety to vanish at any second. Ethan slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life, headlights cutting through sheets of rain as he pulled away from the empty street, the night swallowing behind them like a graveyard of forgotten tears. But inside the car, silence hung heavier than the storm outside. Lily's gaze fixed on him, not with gratitude, but with suspicion sharpened by survival. And just when Ethan thought she might finally rest her weary eyes, her small voice broke through the hum of the engine, carrying words that struck him deeper than any accusation he had faced in his corporate battles. "Are you going to send us back to him?" The plea trembling between terror and resignation, as if she had already prepared her heart for betrayal even in the arms of kindness, and Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his throat closing as he searched for an answer, but none came, leaving only the sound of his painful silence filling the space, a silence heavy enough to keep anyone watching, desperately hooked to know what he would say next. The silence in the car was broken only by the pounding rain against the windshield as Ethan drove with fierce determination, the little girl's question still hanging unanswered between them, gnawing at him like a wound that refused to close. And though his lips never formed a reply, his actions spoke louder than words as he pressed harder on the accelerator, guiding them through the storm-soaked streets until the glowing red cross of the city hospital cut through the darkness like a beacon of salvation. Pulling up to the entrance, he stepped out swiftly, cradling Emma against his chest with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his usually rigid posture, his other hand reaching back to steady Lily as they hurried inside, the blast of sterile warmth from the hospital corridors wrapping around them in stark opposition to the bitter cold they had just escaped. And as soon as they entered a ward, Lily's wide eyes darted until they landed on a fragile figure lying beneath pale sheets, her face drained of color, her body frail as though life itself was slipping away, and with a cry that cracked the heart of anyone within earshot, Lily let go of Ethan's hand and bolted forward, her small arms wrapping around her mother's fragile frame. The woman's eyes fluttered open, tears spilling instantly as she pulled her children close with the last strength she had, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Lily, Emma, I prayed someone would keep you safe," words drenched not only in relief but in desperation, as though she had feared the worst every second she lay helpless in that bed, and Ethan stood frozen at the foot of the bed, watching the raw, unfiltered love between mother and children, a bond unbroken by cruelty or abandonment. And for the first time in years he felt his chest ache with something deeper than pity, an ache of raw recognition, a reminder of what he had once longed for in his own boyhood. Yet before he could dwell on it, voices drifted from the nurses nearby, hushed but sharp enough to reach his ears. Her step-husband refused to pay for treatment. She might not survive the night. And the words hit Ethan like thunder splitting the earth, disbelief flashing into rage at the thought of a man turning his back on the woman fighting for her life and the children clinging to her like lifelines, and in that moment, Ethan's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides, but instead of giving into fury, his eyes locked onto the trembling family before him, and for the first time in his life a decision rose without hesitation, without calculation, without the cold logic that usually ruled his empire. His voice was steady, resolute, carrying the weight of an oath. Do whatever it takes, I'll cover everything. The words cutting through the sterile air like a blade of hope, and the staff around him stilled, their eyes widening as though unaccustomed to seeing such certainty in the face of despair. And yet Ethan's own heart thudded wildly because he could not explain, not even to himself, why the sight of these strangers ignited such a fire inside him, why their suffering pierced deeper than any business deal gone wrong, why his soul, shielded for decades by wealth and walls, was suddenly bleeding at the sight of this fragile family. And as he stood there, the question loomed like a storm cloud ready to burst. Why was Ethan Cross, the untouchable billionaire, so profoundly moved by people he had only just met? Ethan sat on the cold bench outside the emergency ward, his hands pressed tightly together, trembling in a way he hadn't felt since he was a boy. The air smelled of antiseptic and despair, and every sound of hurried footsteps or beeping monitors gnawed at his nerves, reminding him how fragile life could be. And in that silence his chest grew heavy because the sight of that woman fighting for her life had ripped something open inside him, something he thought had been buried under years of business deals, luxury cars, and glass towers, but all it took was one pale face and two terrified little girls to shatter the illusion of control he had built. And as he leaned back against the cold wall, his mind dragged him violently into the past, back to a bitter winter night when his father's voice had been the last sound he heard before the door slammed shut, leaving a small boy with nothing but an empty stomach and a frozen pillow. And Ethan remembered huddling in a thin blanket, waiting for footsteps that never returned, praying for someone to notice, someone to care, but no one ever came, and that night something inside him had cracked, whispering that he was disposable, just another burden to throw away, and for years he had covered that wound with arrogance, wealth, and silence. Yet now, watching Lily's trembling hands hold her sister, he realized he was staring at a mirror of his younger self, vulnerable, abandoned, begging for a protector who might never arrive. His throat burned, his eyes blurred, and for the first time in decades, Ethan let the memories crash into him without resistance, whispering under his breath words he hadn't dared to say aloud. "I know what it feels like to be thrown away." The confession tasting like blood and salt as it left his lips, a truth he had hidden behind power suits and boardroom victories but could no longer deny. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, his fingers digging into his knees as though to anchor himself, when suddenly a small hand tugged gently at his sleeve, pulling him out of the storm of memory, and he looked down to see Lily staring at him with wide, tearful eyes, her innocence piercing deeper than any memory could, and she asked in her tiny, cracking voice, "Are you crying, mister?" And in that moment, Ethan's carefully built armor threatened to collapse entirely, because no one had ever, sked him that with such purity, such honesty, and he felt a sting of shame that a child could see what adults never did, so he blinked furiously, forcing a trembling smile onto his face though his cheeks were still damp, whispering back as softly as he could, "No, Lily. Maybe I'm finally healing." And the words startled even him, because for the first time they didn't sound like a lie but like a fragile truth clawing its way out of the ruins of his past. And Lily didn't answer, but leaned her little head against his arm, offering the quiet comfort only a child could give, while Ethan sat frozen, realizing that in giving safety to these girls, he was slowly giving it back to the little boy inside him who had been waiting all these years. Yet even as this fragile connection formed, dread clawed at the edges of his thoughts because the doctors were still inside with their mother, the monitors still beeped with uncertainty, and he knew money could buy time but not miracles. And as his eyes drifted back to the closed doors, a single question haunted him like a curse. Would she survive the night, or would these girls be left to carry the same wound that had nearly destroyed him? Ethan's eyes, still wet from the tears he had hidden from Lily, lifted as the doctor finally emerged from the emergency room, his expression heavy yet carrying a small measure of relief. "She's stable," the doctor began, his voice calm but edged with warning. "But her condition is fragile. Months of treatment and care will be required if she is to fully recover. Without it, she won't survive." Those words pierced through the tense silence of the corridor like a blade, and Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He turned his gaze toward the small waiting area where Lily sat clutching Emma's tiny hand, her innocent eyes flickering between hope and dread, too young to grasp the weight of medical terms, but old enough to sense the severity of the moment. Ethan swallowed hard, rising to his feet, his expensive shoes clicking softly against the hospital's cold floor as he approached the doctor. "Do everything necessary," he said firmly, his voice carrying a conviction that even startled him. "Don't hold anything back because of costs. I'll take care of every expense." The doctor nodded, though his skeptical glance lingered. So many men had promised, so few had followed through. Yet Ethan's tone held no room for doubt. Moments later, the nurse guided him into the recovery ward, where the mother lay pale against crisp white sheets, her frail hand trembling as she reached out. Lily rushed forward, climbing onto the edge of the bed, her tears spilling onto her mother's gown. "Mommy, please don't leave us," she whispered desperately, her voice shaking with fear. Emma whimpered softly, curling against her mother's weak arm as though her tiny body could shield her from death itself. The mother's lips quivered as she tried to speak, but her gaze shifted toward Ethan, who stood silently at the bedside, unsure whether he was intruding or offering the only lifeline left. She stretched her hand toward him, and though hesitant at first, Ethan stepped closer and let her fragile fingers curl around his strong, steady palm. Tears slipped from her weary eyes as she murmured, "Why are you helping us? We are nothing to you." The room seemed to still in that instant, even the machines beside her bed humming with quiet solemnity, waiting for his answer. Ethan's jaw tightened, his throat aching as memories of his own childhood came rushing back. Nights spent on the streets, shivering with hunger, waiting for someone, anyone, to show him mercy. His father's cold rejection had burned scars too deep to erase, but in these children's mother, in her fear of being discarded, he saw himself reflected all over again. His voice broke slightly as he leaned closer, his grip firm on her hand. "No. You are not nothing. You are everything. Because once, I was that child. Alone, frightened, desperate for someone to care. And no one came." A silence fell, heavy and reverent, as the weight of his confession hung in the air. The mother wept harder, not only for her pain, but for his hidden wounds, for the boy he once was, abandoned and unseen. Lily lifted her tear-streaked face, her innocent eyes widening as though she finally understood why this stranger had risked so much for them. She whispered softly, "So, you're like us?" Ethan knelt by the bed, nodding with tears shining in his eyes. "Yes, Lily. And I swore to myself, if I ever had the power to stop it from happening to another child, I would." His voice carried both pain and promise, a vow he had never spoken aloud until this moment. Emma's tiny hand reached toward him, and instinctively Ethan brushed his fingers gently against hers, feeling an unfamiliar warmth bloom in his chest, a connection deeper than logic or circumstance. The mother, overwhelmed, tried to speak again, her lips forming the question she barely dared to ask. "But why risk so much? For us?" Ethan's eyes met hers, unflinching, raw with honesty. "Because if I walk away now, I become the same man who abandoned me, and I can't live with that." The words struck like thunder in the quiet ward, leaving the mother trembling, her tears flowing freely as she whispered, "Then God must have sent you." Ethan said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes, of guilt, of redemption, of a heart finally unchained by compassion. For a long moment he simply sat there, holding her hand, listening to the quiet rhythm of the monitor that measured her fragile heartbeat, knowing that in helping her survive, he might finally save a part of himself too. Yet beneath that tender resolve, one haunting question remained unanswered. Could he truly shoulder this burden, not just with his wealth, but with his soul? Ethan did more than pay the bills. He bought the family, a warm home near the hospital, a place where laughter could echo again instead of silence filled with fear, and he made sure that every corner spoke of comfort, safety, and dignity they had long been denied. Each day he arrived with fresh meals wrapped in the scent of care, toys that lit up Emma's eyes, and books that made Lily's imagination dance. But more than all of these, he carried with him something priceless: time, attention, and a presence that told them they mattered, that they were seen, that they were worth loving. And while the hospital corridors had once been heavy with despair, his footsteps now seemed to replace that despair with hope, and the nurses whispered in awe about the strange man who never left their side. Not as a benefactor alone, but as someone who seemed to be stitching his own wounds as he stitched theirs, And in quiet evenings, when the world outside grew dark and the city lights blinked like distant stars, Lily would race down the hallway and leap into his arms with unfiltered joy, whispering against his chest, "You're not just a millionaire, you're our hero." Words that crashed into Ethan like waves upon a weary shore, for though his name had been tied to wealth and power for years, no accolade, no headline, no amount of money had ever given him the peace that now trembled in his heart as those small hands clung to him. He would hold her tightly, realizing that the emptiness he once tried to bury under business deals and luxury had been waiting for this very moment of belonging, and as Emma shyly offered him her little drawings of a man holding two girls' hands under a bright sun, he felt tears blur his vision, because for the first time he saw himself not as the cold tycoon the world had painted him to be, but as a father figure, as a man capable of love deeper than contracts and numbers. And when their mother, fragile but recovering, finally found the courage to ask why he cared so deeply for a family that was nothing to him, Ethan knelt by her bedside, his voice breaking yet firm, saying through tears that shimmered like unspo, "Ken promises, because once I was waiting for someone to say the words I'm saying to you now, you're not alone anymore." And in that instant, a silence wrapped them, a silence not of emptiness, but of healing, where pain of the past dissolved into the warmth of connection, and Ethan knew that destiny had not merely brought him to strangers, but had brought him home, to a place where his broken heart could finally rest, no longer in shadows of abandonment but in the light of a family that chose him as much as he chose them.